important to stress, though, that when one thinks of geopolitics, it's important to keep in mind that there is a military basis component of the United States' geopolitical interests in the Caribbean. Caribbean has been called different things over the decades in relation to the geopolitical interests of the United States in the region. It's been called the Southern Flank. It's been called the United States Strategic Rear. It's been called the Third Border. It was very key to global projection by the United States before 9/11, but particularly since 9/11, it's also become key to the Homeland Security metric the United States has adopted. And if you ask the question where within the Caribbean one might find bases, if you go to Aruba and Curaçao, you'll find some bases that are critical to what the United States does in counter-narcotics. They're called forward operating locations. If you go to the Bahamas, in Andros Island, you'll find something called the Atlantic Underwater Testing and Evaluation Center. Interesting acronym. But a facility that is critical to what the United States Navy does in submarine training and submarine evaluation. That Andros facility dates back to World War II, part of a broad agreement, part of the Lend-Lease agreement between the United States and Britain at the time, where Britain gave rights to some of its then territories in the region and in Canada, and in exchange the United States gave Britain a number of destroyers to fight in World War II. But keep in mind that Guantanamo Base is still there. Cuba doesn't cash the checks that the United States deposits in Switzerland, but there's a base in Guantanamo. Antigua and Barbuda also has a base that is important to what the United States Air Force does. One of the interesting realities of politics is sometimes where you stand depends on where you sit. I recall very interestingly, but very clearly, that when the current Prime Minister of Antigua was in the opposition, he was anxious for the United States base there to close. But once he became Prime Minister and he saw the economic value of it, he signed a renewal agreement in 2004. But keep in mind that it's not simply in some of the quote-unquote larger islands. Antigua represents, as part of the Eastern Caribbean, a base operation for the United States. I'm going to quickly pass over the fact that important to America's military and commercial interests is the existence of what are called vital sea lanes of communication. If you take a look at the sea lanes map of the Caribbean, you'll quickly appreciate how America finds for its own and for its allies' interests the existence of navigable passages to bring commerce back and forth. Interestingly enough, these very navigable passages are also used by the drug guys to bring their drugs back and forth. So keep in mind the Caribbean Sea itself, what I call the sea space, is part of the geopolitical map for United States interests. So let's transition then from the first question, what are some United States interests in the Caribbean, to the second question. The second question being, what are some key security interests facing the region that make those issues also United States issues because of the national interests the United States has in the region? Well, one of those, depending upon what you ask, you may need to ask something else, also shows up here. If you ask the question, what are the key security issues facing the Caribbean that also are United States issues, it begs the question, what do you mean by security? And so I'll give you my working definition of security, a definition I've been using for several years now. I outlined it in a book I wrote in 1993 called The Quest for Security in the Caribbean. And I said there, and I keep as a working definition still, security for me means the protection and preservation of a people's freedom from external military attack and coercion, from internal subversion, and from the erosion of cherished political, economic, and social values. Keep in mind that my approach to security, which is not limited to my approach, many other scholars use it, sees security not just in its military element, For me, security is a multidimensional reality. It is military, it is also political, it is also economic, and it is also environmental. And if you take the broad multidimensional approach to security, you'll find that within that purview, there are both traditional and non-traditional security issues. You find as well that the challenges, the threats, the concerns are not simply external, somebody trying to beat you up from the outside. Internal security is also important. And partly because of that dynamic of multidimensionality, not just being external, not just being military, part of the difficulty that Caribbean countries have in responding to security challenges is that the military response alone is not sufficient. You've got to do things in beyond the military. You've got to do things in the political front. You've got to do things in the economic front. And the resources are just not there for that. A few years ago, I designed a theoretical schema that tries to capture into one map the connection between internal and external, the connection between military, political, economic, and environment, and the reality that in any particular country and the region as a whole, one has to approach responding in economic, in political, in diplomatic, in law enforcement terms. But we're not going to spend time on that right now. Now, if you were to ask the question, keeping in mind that the security challenges in the Caribbean involve some traditional issues, the question becomes, what are some of those traditional issues? Border and territorial disputes come to the fore. If you were to tally up the number of border and territorial disputes within the Caribbean basin, you'll find about 34, 35 as of 2010, August. Some of them you don't hear about, but the fact that they may not make the news all the time does not mean they're not there. Most of them are dormant, but they have still not been officially resolved. You might recall that there was a maritime dispute between Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago a few years ago. It was settled by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Arbitral Tribunal. It was a maritime dispute about where does the maritime boundary for Trinidad begin and end. There's still some issues that they're working out. You might also recall that Guyana and Suriname had a dispute that also of a maritime nature was taken to the very United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and was settled in September 2007. But there are several other significant disputes that have not been resolved, have had fits and starts in resolution. One of them is the Belize Guatemala dispute. Many of us were excited in 2002 when under the OAS there was a basis for a resolution. That got caught up in the domestic politics within Guatemala and within Belize and never got to the resolution stage. And a year or so ago, the two countries decided to take it to the International Court of Justice. They're working through that process. So the Guatemala-Belize dispute is a significant one, and it is still under construction so far as resolution is concerned. But you have in that list of 34 or 35 countries, some countries that have multiple disputes. And Guyana and Suriname and Guyana and Venezuela reflect some of that. You might know, for example, that Venezuela has a claim to 5/8 of Guyana on the western front. They are arguing that everything west of the Essequibo River belongs to them. But there is also a dispute, a claim on the part of Suriname on the eastern front for a 15,000 square kilometer area. Suriname claims it's them. I'm going to come back to the Guyana Suriname in a minute and the Guyana Venezuela in a minute because there's some interesting contemporary dynamics in relation to those two disputes. And one of those interesting dynamics in relation to the Venezuela claim to Guyana is that if you were to go to an official in Caracas website for a map of Venezuela, you will see as part of the definition of Venezuela by Venezuelan government what we in the rest of the hemisphere and the rest of the world know as a part of Guyana. Officially, Venezuela defines in its maps what they call Guyana Essequiba, what we call Essequibo territory, everything west of the Essequibo River, that the world and Guyana accept as part of Guyana, Venezuela defines as Venezuela. But interestingly enough, Suriname has also begun to define that 15 square kilometer publicly as its territory. Issue arose last November in Washington when, at the World Bank Conference, Venezuela, for the first time internationally, in Washington, put as part of its definition of its geography that 15,000 square kilometers issue. And that dynamic is going to be an ongoing dynamic in Guyana-Suriname relations because of what the implications are of that. And the implications are simply this. If Suriname persists in defining geographically that 15,000 square kilometers as itself, and Guyana does nothing, the more that map becomes replicated, the more that map is going to be accepted as the definition of Suriname. That is an issue that has a lot of potential for tension between Suriname and Guyana, particularly given recent elections in Suriname. But if you were to leave the traditional border and territorial disputes to the side, and you ask the question, well, what about the non-traditional security issues? The non-traditional security issues, by and large, have greater resonance. They are a greater, clear and present danger for Caribbean countries than the border and territorial disputes. And I like the way in which Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General, captured such issues. He called them problems with our passports. And some of those problems with our passports for the Caribbean involve crime, involve drugs, involve arms trafficking, they involve environmental challenges. Crime is significant in a variety of respects, not only because it has an impact on the psyche of the population. It is important because it has economic costs, and it's an economic deterrent for foreign investment in the region. The United States is not the only nation other than Caribbean countries that is worried about crime. There are good reasons for the crime and violence issue to resonate significantly and to be of concern to the region as a whole. The issue of crime often resonates with people within the region, with the American media, in relation to the gun violence, that often drives homicides. And it is no consolation, for example, for St. Vincent and the Grenadines to say that Puerto Rico has more murders than it does. It's no consolation for Guyana to say that last year its crime homicides rate declined in a way in which it didn't decline in Jamaica. It actually grew in Jamaica, as we'll see in a minute. This kind of headline, captured in the Jamaican Gleaner a few years ago, is not a comforting headline for locals. It's not a comforting headline for foreigners, particularly if you think of the tourism aspect. Then you have a screaming headline that says 1 murder every 6 hours. It's not a good thing, especially if it is not the reality of all time. But if you were to take just the last 4 or 5 years in Caribbean countries, you'll find an uncomfortable increase in homicides. Jamaica with 2.6 people, 1,674 murders in 2005, 1,618 murders in 2008, 1,680 murders in 2009. And so if you look across the region, even if you say that in the Anglophone Caribbean, Jamaica is an anomaly, you'll find an uncomfortably high murder rate. As a matter of fact, the Caribbean has now the dubious distinction of having the world's highest per capita murder rate. Not a good thing. And part of what is worrying about the region and the murder rate in the region is what I call the existence of the two G's, guns and the gangs. Reality is that many, if not most, of the murders are committed by weapons, illegal weapons. But it is not simply the existence of high numbers of homicides and the use of weapons. It's the reality that places in the Caribbean now are having experiences with crime that one did not 5 or even 10 years ago think about in relation to the Caribbean. St. Lucia, for example, a couple of months ago, Magistrate Anne-Marie Smith attempted assassination 8 o'clock in the morning, simply because she was getting tougher on the drug guys and they just wanted to rub her out. You think of the kidnappings in Ghana in the last few years. Thankfully, they've come down. Think of the kidnappings in Trinidad and Haiti in the last few years. Thankfully, they have come down. But it is not only the existence of the crime, it's the character of the crime, the heinous character of the crime, which now is defining in a very negative way the reality of the region. But when you think of not just the crime, but the resources to deal with the crime, there are other issues. Insufficient numbers of police. I saw a screaming headline in Trinidad and Tobago only a week ago. Trinidad and Tobago short of 1,200 policemen. When you think of the insufficient resources, not just in the police side, but in terms of the prison side, in terms of the courts, the capacity of Caribbean countries to deal with the crime is part of what is limiting the ability to curb the crime. And it's not just the quote-unquote good guys who know the police limitations and the country's limitations, the bad guys know it as well. And so they're profiting from that reality of limited resources. They're profiting from that reality of an insufficient capacity to deal with crime. Even a place that has the money, like Trinidad and Tobago. The dent on crime has not been what it should be, leading to some very interesting initiatives over the last 4 or 5 years. Jamaica brought in someone from Britain to help for a long time. That person's contract has ended, but he stayed on in Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago has just hired, he starts his job next month, September 2010, a commissioner of police coming from Canada and a deputy coming from Canada, paid high dollars in US currency. I can anticipate a lot of tension within the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service because of that dynamic. It's not new. St. Lucia experienced it a couple of years ago, as did Antigua. But the effort of where do we alternatively find leadership to help deal with the crime, whether it's on a permanent basis, whether it's on a consultative basis, that is part of the reality of responding on the part of governments in the region about this clear and present danger. The drugs reality helps to fuel some of that crime, and I like to remind people that the drugs reality is not a one-dimensional reality. It's not simply drugs passing through the region. There's illegal production of substances in the Caribbean. Interesting headline 2 days ago, significant numbers of marijuana, significant poundage of marijuana put in tombstones in Jamaica to be shipped to United Kingdom. I wrote a book years ago called Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, and I spent an entire chapter on trafficking. And I detailed some of the various ways over the decades people have used their creativity and ingenuity to package drugs, whether it's marijuana or cocaine or hash oil. I think this last, putting it in the tombstones, could be added to that list of ingenious ways of trying to move drugs. Try to put them in fish, they put them in a whole bunch of other things. But the point I'm making is that the issue of drugs is not simply a trafficking issue. Production is there, money laundering is there, illegal consumption also happens in the Caribbean. And all those, what I call the main problem areas, production, trafficking, consumption, abuse, and money laundering, have connections to and implications for other things, for arms trafficking, for the violence, for the corruption, for economic allocation of resources that sometimes leave insufficient resources for education and health and water supply, because money has to be put to fight the drugs, put to fight the crime, which are the very clear and present dangers. Very interesting, signally important summit held in Barbados in 1997 May. First time a United States president, Bill Clinton at the time, went to the Caribbean to meet Caribbean leaders. One of the items in that list of issues discussed was arms trafficking. It was a danger then, it still is a danger. But part of that reality of the arms trafficking in the Caribbean is the reality that it is no longer true that the weapons come only from the United States. It is no longer true that the weapons come from North or from Europe. It was never entirely true that the United States was the only source. You might recall in the 90s the Guns for Antigua case, where weapons were imported through Antigua from Israel, intended for Colombia. Really, the Antiguan Defense Force was caught up in some corruption. They facilitated the movement of illegal weapons from Israel to Colombia. But last few years, we've been finding significant movement of weapons, illegal weapons, from South America, from Venezuela, from Colombia, from Brazil, from Guyana, into the island Caribbean. And so where the flow happens also is of importance in terms of what you try to do to deal with that flow, that illegal movement of weapons. It is still a challenge for the United States in relation to helping to stem the flow of weapons from the United States, in having the umbrella federal authority through the treaty that was signed in the OAS in 1997. One of the harsh realities is that the federal system sometimes complicates America's ability to do things as a nation. And so although in November of 1997, the United States signed the Inter-American Convention on Illegal Movement of Weapons, the United States Senate has still not ratified that convention. Actually, President Obama, at the summit of the Americas in Trinidad, made a pledge to push to ensure that the United States does ratify and can do collective federal action in helping to stem the flow of weapons. Now, that does not mean the United States, in very many of its agencies, have not been doing something about helping Caribbean countries with weapons movement from the United States to the region. That still remains a significant, clear, and present danger. It connects to the crime, it connects to the drugs in very significant ways. But also keep in mind the vulnerability of Caribbean countries and the reality that the environment is a significant factor in all this. And sometimes it doesn't have to rise to the level of a hurricane. Guyana had a devastating rainfall in 2005, which affected about 85% of the population. Not only affecting about 85% of the population, but the estimated loss to the GE, the national product of Guyana, was something like $490 million US. You think of the Haitian catastrophe of this year, you can have an understanding of what earthquakes can do for the Caribbean. But I also like to remind people that although the scope of earthquakes the size of Haiti this year is rare, the Caribbean has had a healthy history of earthquakes damaging the region over time, which means that we need to keep that as part of the landscape of clear and present dangers in the things that are in the security arena. And may not have heard about the earthquake in Martinique in 2007, but it happened. May not have heard about the earthquake in the Cayman Islands in January of this year, but it happened. Historically, we know that if one looks back to 1692, you know that Port Royal, which was at the time the headquarters, the capital of Jamaica, was destroyed by an earthquake. And so there is a part of a history of earthquakes as part of an environmental challenge that the Caribbean still needs to keep in mind. So let me, in summary, say a couple of things. That in thinking of United States Caribbean countries, United States-Caribbean relations. It's important to go beyond the individual Obama as leader, notwithstanding the significance of his election. It's important to think of the national interests of the United States. And it's important to keep in mind that those threats that resonate with the Caribbean that also have become threats for the United States because of those national interests are complicated by the reality of being multidimensional. Crime is not a single-dimensional issue. Drugs is not a single-dimensional issue. And partly because of the multinational and the multidimensional element, collaboration has got to be part of what the game plan is. Collaboration between the United States and the Caribbean, collaboration between the United States and European countries that have an interest in the Caribbean still and have national geopolitical interest in the Caribbean, and collaboration within the Caribbean, whether it's the regional security system, whether it is the impact that's based in Trinidad and Tobago. Collaboration is not simply desirable, I would think. I think collaboration is absolutely necessary.